His empire was built on ice and shadows, and his voice was the command that could make markets crumble. Yet, as he looked at her, standing by the rain-lashed window with a packed bag at her feet, Lucien Black's voice was a raw, broken thing he no longer recognized. "Don't," he whispered, the word a ghost in the cavernous room. Her only crime had been to show him the sun, and now she was taking it with her. He, who had bought her, owned her, and intended to break her, was about to shatter himself. "Aria, please." His hand, the one that signed checks for billions without a tremor, now shook as he reached for her. "Stay. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments." The scent of stale cigar smoke and betrayal clung to the velvet curtains of her stepfather's study. Aria Vega stood frozen, the delicate teacup in her hand suddenly feeling as heavy as a lead weight. The words he'd spoken slithered around the room, coiling around her throat until she could barely breathe. Sold. It was a medieval word, a barbaric concept that had no place in the gleaming modern world of the 21st century. Yet, it was her reality. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice a fragile thread of sound. Richard Davenport, the man who had married her mother and inherited her trust fund upon her untimely death, didn't even have the decency to look her in the eye. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler, his reflection a distorted mask in the polished mahogany desk. "You heard me, Aria. My debtors are insistent. Their patience has run out. You are the only asset I have left that can clear the slate." An asset, like a prize mare or a piece of art. Bile rose in her throat. "I am your stepdaughter. I am Maria's daughter. You can't do this." "Can't I?" He finally looked up, and the cold reptilian gleam in his eyes snuffed out the last flicker of hope in her heart. This wasn't the affable, charming man who had swept her grieving mother off her feet. This was a stranger, a monster wearing a familiar face. "The arrangements have been made. It's a private auction, very exclusive. For men who appreciate rare things, you'll fetch a handsome price, more than enough to settle my accounts and set me up nicely again." He spoke of her as if she were a vintage car, not a 22-year-old woman with dreams of finishing her art degree and opening a small gallery. The life she had been painstakingly piecing back together after her mother's death just 2 years prior was about to be obliterated. "No," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of the steel she didn't know she possessed. She placed the teacup down with a sharp clink. "I won't let you." Richard laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "And how do you plan to stop me? Run?" "My dear girl, the people I owe money to are not corner store bookies. They have eyes everywhere. There is nowhere you could go that they wouldn't find you, and when they did, what they would do to you would be far, far worse than what awaits you tomorrow night. This way is cleaner, more civilized." Civilized. The word was a profanity. The next 24 hours passed in a surreal haze. Her phone was taken, the internet to the house was cut, and 2 burly men who looked like they'd been carved from granite were posted outside her bedroom door. There was no escape. She was a prisoner in her own home, a lamb being primped and prepped for slaughter. The following evening, she was forced into a simple, elegant black dress that clung to her form in a way that made her feel naked, exposed. It was designed to showcase the asset. Richard, dressed in a tailored tuxedo, looked at her with the calculating eye of a merchant. "Excellent," he murmured, a greedy smile touching his lips. "You will do very well." They drove in silence to a palatial estate nestled in the hills overlooking the city, a place of obscene wealth and hidden sins. The air inside was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and moral decay. Men in bespoke suits with predators' eyes watched her as Richard led her through the opulent ballroom to a smaller, more private chamber. It was decorated like a Victorian theater, with plush red velvet seats arranged in a semicircle around a small raised platform. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was it, the point of no return. Richard's hand on her arm was a manacle. He pushed her gently towards the platform. "Be a good girl, Aria. Don't make a scene. It will only make things worse." She stood there, bathed in a soft spotlight, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, stripping her bare, appraising her, pricing her. An auctioneer, a slick man with a practiced smile, began his spiel, his voice a smooth, venomous river. He spoke of her breeding, her education, her innocence, all commodities to be bought and sold. The bidding started. A number was thrown out, then another, higher. The figures were obscene, life-changing sums of money exchanged for a human life. Her life. She felt dissociated, as if she were floating above her own body, watching a horror film. She refused to cry. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She lifted her chin, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the monsters who sought to own her, and she met each stare with a silent, defiant fury. Then, the atmosphere in the room shifted. A palpable chill swept through the air as a door at the back of the chamber opened. A man stepped in, and the murmuring of the bidders died in their throats. He was tall, dressed in a black suit so perfectly tailored it seemed molded to his powerful frame. His hair was as black as a raven's wing, and his face was a masterpiece of harsh, aristocratic angles. But it was his eyes that held the room captive. They were the color of a stormy sky, cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of emotion. He didn't take a seat. He simply stood by the doorway, his presence a vortex that pulled all light and warmth from the room. The auctioneer faltered for a moment, visibly intimidated. "The bidding stands at 2 million, the auctioneer finally managed, his voice a little less steady. A man in the front row, florid and sweating, raised his paddle. 2.5. A low, resonant voice cut through the room from the back. It was quiet, yet it carried an authority that was absolute. 10 million. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled bidders. Heads swiveled to stare at the newcomer. 10 million. It was an astronomical, ludicrous leap. It wasn't a bid, it was a declaration of war. It was a statement of ownership before the purchase was even complete. The florid-faced man sank back into his seat, his face pale. No one else dared to speak. The auctioneer, his eyes wide, looked around the room. 10 million, he repeated, his voice trembling slightly. "Do I hear any other bids? Going once, going twice." He didn't need to finish. The room was silent, cowed by the sheer audacity of the man in the doorway. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed the shattering of Aria's world. "Sold," the auctioneer breathed, "to Mr. Lucien Black." Lucien Black. The name resonated in the silence. Even Aria, who paid little attention to the world of high finance, had heard of him. He was a myth, a phantom of the corporate world, a ruthless tycoon who devoured companies whole and left his competitors in ruins. He was known for his cold-blooded precision and his utter lack of mercy. And he had just bought her. He didn't smile. He didn't react at all. He simply gave a curt nod to a man who stood beside him, a man with the build of a professional fighter and a scar that cut through one eyebrow. The man, presumably his security, moved forward. Richard Davenport, her stepfather, practically scurried towards Lucien Black, his hand outstretched, his face a mask of sycophantic greed. Lucien ignored the outstretched hand completely. His storm-gray eyes, which had so far remained impersonal, finally moved, sweeping over the crowd and landing on her. For the first time, their gazes locked. In that moment, Aria felt a jolt, a spark of something that was not just fear, but a terrifying, unwanted recognition. It was like looking into the eyes of a wolf, intelligent, ancient, and utterly wild. He wasn't just a monster, he was an apex predator. And she was his prey. The security guard reached the platform and stood beside her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was an invisible cage. The transaction was complete. Richard received an electronic transfer confirmation from Lucien's aide, his eyes lighting up with a manic glee that made Aria's stomach churn. He glanced at her one last time, not with guilt or remorse, but with the triumphant air of a man who had successfully closed a profitable deal. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing from her life as abruptly as he had entered it, leaving her in the possession of the cruelest billionaire in the world. The drive to Lucien Black's home was a silent, tense affair. Aria sat in the back of a black Maybach, with seats so soft they felt like clouds, the irony almost laughable. She was a possession being transported in the pinnacle of luxury. Lucien sat opposite her, not beside her, the space between them a chasm of unspoken threat. He hadn't spoken a single word to her since the auction. He simply watched her with those unnerving gray eyes, his expression unreadable, his posture relaxed but radiating a coiled energy that kept her on high alert. The car finally swept through a set of immense wrought iron gates and up a long, winding driveway flanked by ancient oak trees. The mansion that emerged from the misty night was less a home and more a fortress. It was a stark, modernist monolith of glass, steel, and black stone, a monument to power and isolation. It loomed against the skyline, sharp and unforgiving, much like the man who owned it. Inside, the oppressive silence continued. The foyer was a cavern of gleaming marble and minimalist art, cold and impersonal. A woman in a severe gray uniform, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, greeted them at the door. "Mr. Black, welcome home." "Mrs. Albright," he acknowledged, his voice a low rumble. "This is Aria. She will be staying here. Show her to the Onyx Suite. See that she has everything she needs. Everything she needs." The words were a mockery. The one thing she needed her freedom was, the one thing he would never give her. Mrs. Albright's eyes flickered towards Aria for a fraction of a second, her expression neutral but her gaze sharp. "Of course, sir. This way, miss." Aria followed the housekeeper up a floating staircase that seemed to defy gravity. The house was a labyrinth of stark corridors and vast, empty rooms. It felt less like a home and more like a museum, curated and sterile, with no sign of personal warmth or life. The Onyx Suite was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. One entire wall was a floor-to-ceiling window offering a panoramic, godlike view of the city lights twinkling below. The bed was king-sized, draped in black silk sheets. A walk-in closet was already filled with designer clothes in her size, shoes of every style, and jewelry that glittered malevolently from velvet-lined trays. It was a gilded cage, exquisitely furnished and utterly inescapable. "A chef will prepare your meals. You may request anything you wish," Mrs. Albright stated, her tone professional and detached. "Mr. Black has only 2 rules. 1. You are not to enter his private wing, which is the entire east side of this floor. 2. You are not to attempt to leave the property. The grounds are extensive, but the perimeter is a separate. Secured. Is that understood?" Aria nodded, her throat too tight to speak. When the housekeeper left, closing the door with a soft click, Aria finally let out the breath she'd been holding. She walked to the immense window and pressed her hand against the cold glass. She was a princess in a tower, but her prince was the dragon who guarded it. For the first few days, she saw almost nothing of Lucien Black. He was a phantom in his own home. She would hear his helicopter leaving in the morning and returning late at night. Meals were served to her in her suite, or in a vast, empty dining room where a place was set for him, though he never appeared. She was left to wander the sterile halls of the West Wing, a ghost in a palace of shadows. She refused to wear the clothes he had bought for her, continuing to wear the simple black dress from the auction, and then the few casual clothes she'd been wearing when her life was stolen from her. It was a small, pathetic act of defiance, but it was hers. She explored every inch of her prison, noting the cameras discreetly placed in the corners of rooms, the silent, watchful presence of the security staff. One afternoon, driven by a desperate boredom, she discovered a library. Unlike the rest of the house, this room felt lived in. Books overflowed from shelves that stretched 2 stories high, accessed by a rolling ladder. They were classics, philosophy, poetry, business texts, a map of a complex and brilliant mind. In a corner, she found a section on art history. Her fingers trembled as she traced the spines of the books, a painful reminder of the life that had been stolen from her. She pulled out a heavy tome on the Italian Renaissance and sat in a worn leather armchair that seemed to envelop her. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of something other than fear or anger. She lost herself in the world of Botticelli and Michelangelo, the scent of old paper and leather a comforting balm to her frayed nerves. She didn't hear him enter. "I didn't take you for a reader." His voice, so close, made her jump. She looked up to see Lucien Black standing a few feet away, watching her. He had shed his suit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his white shirt, revealing muscular forearms dusted with fine, dark hair. He looked less like a corporate titan and more like a predator at rest. "There's a lot you don't know about me," she retorted, her voice sharper than she intended. A ghost of the smile, so faint it was barely there, touched his lips. "I know that you were sold to settle your stepfather's gambling debts. I know you were studying art history at the city university. And I know you have been in my house for 4 days and have refused to eat anything but toast and tea. You are defiant, proud, and you are starving yourself for a point that I assure you, you will not win." He knew about her studies. The thought was unnerving. He had investigated her, catalogued her life, just as he catalogued his companies. "I'm not your property to be analyzed, Mr. Black. You have been my property since the moment the gavel fell," he stated, his voice dropping the hint of amusement and becoming as cold and hard as the stone walls of Miles. His home. "You will eat. You will dress in the clothes provided for you. You will follow the rules, or I will be forced to teach you them." The threat hung in the air between them, ugly and raw. Aria's heart pounded, but she refused to look away. "And what will you do? Lock me in a room? I'm already in a cage. You can't make it any smaller." He took a step closer, and she had to fight the instinct to flinch. He leaned down, placing his hands on the arms of her chair, trapping her. His face was inches from hers, and she could see the flecks of silver in his stormy eyes. He smelled of expensive cologne and something else, something wild and elemental, like a storm rolling in over the ocean. "Don't test me, Aria," he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You have no idea of the depths of my cruelty. You think this is a cage? This is a sanctuary. I saved you from a room full of men who would have treated you like a toy to be broken and discarded. You should be thanking me." "Thanking you?" she choked out, a hysterical laugh bubbling in her chest. "You bought me like a slave. You hold me here against my will. You are no better than any of them." For a second, something flickered in his Issei flash of raw, unguarded pain. It was there and gone so quickly, she thought she might have imagined it. He straightened up, his cold mask snapping back into place. "You will join me for dinner tonight, at 8 o'clock, in the dining room. Wear something appropriate," he commanded, then turned and walked out of the library, leaving her trembling with a confusing mix of terror and a strange, unsettling curiosity about the man who claimed to be her savior and her jailer. That night, Aria decided to obey, not out of fear, but out of a calculated curiosity. She wanted to understand the man who held her life in his hands. She chose a simple, emerald green dress from the closet, a color that brought out the fire in her auburn hair. When she entered the dining room at precisely 8, he was already there, standing by the window, looking out at the city. He turned, and for a moment his gaze swept over her, and his mask of indifference slipped. There was a flicker of appreciation, of something primal and possessive in his eyes before he shuttered it away. "Good," was all he said. Dinner was a tense, silent affair. The food was exquisite, course after course of culinary masterpieces served by silent staff, but Aria could barely taste it. The tension between them was a physical presence at the table. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, she spoke. "Why me?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear in the cavernous room. "You could have any woman in the world. Why buy one at an auction?" Lucien paused, his wine glass halfway to his lips. He considered her for a long moment, his gray eyes analytical. "Because I don't want a woman who wants me for my money or my power. I wanted something pure, something untouched by the filth of my world. And you thought you could find that at a human auction?" she scoffed. "You bought a person, Mr. Black, not a concept." "My name is Lucien," he corrected her, his voice soft but firm. "And I bought you, Aria, not a person, you. I saw the fire in your eyes on that stage. Every other person in that room was cowed or broken, but you looked like you wanted to burn them all to the ground. I bought your defiance." "I?" His words sent a shiver down her spine. He hadn't bought her to be a docile pet. He had bought her for the very spirit she was trying to use against him. The thought was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. As the days turned into weeks, a strange, unnerving routine began to form. Aria would spend her days in the library, losing herself in the world of art, a small rebellion that Lucien, for reasons she couldn't fathom, allowed. Every evening, they would have dinner together. Their conversations were like a chess match, a careful dance of questions and evasions. She learned he was a prodigy who had built his empire from nothing after a tragic family event he refused to speak of. He learned she was an orphan who cherished her mother's memory and dreamed of a life filled with color and beauty, a stark contrast to his monochromatic existence. She started to see the cracks in his cold façade. Sometimes, late at night, she would hear him pacing in his forbidden east wing. Once, she heard the sound of something shattering, followed by a roar of pure animalistic rage and grief that made the hair on her arms stand up. She saw the exhaustion that sometimes shattered his eyes, the deep-seated loneliness that even his vast fortune couldn't erase. He was a man at war with himself, a prisoner in his own fortress. One rainy afternoon, she found a door in the library that she hadn't noticed before, tucked away behind a tapestry. It was unlocked. Curiosity overriding her caution, she opened it and stepped through. It led to a dusty, forgotten hallway. At the end of it was another door. Hesitantly, she pushed it open. The room was a child's nursery, frozen in time. A layer of dust covered everything, but it was otherwise perfectly preserved. A small wooden rocking horse stood in the corner, and a mobile of faded pastel planets hung over an empty crib. On a small bedside table was a silver picture frame, face down. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. She turned it over. The picture was of a smiling woman with warm, kind eyes so much like Lucien's, holding a small boy with the same black hair and serious expression. The boy couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. It was him. A wave of understanding washed over her. This was the source of his pain. This was the heart of the East Wing's mystery. "What are you doing in here?" His voice was like a whip crack. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Lucien stood in the doorway, his face a thunderous mask of fury. But beneath the anger, she saw it again, that raw, gut-wrenching pain. I found the door," she stammered, holding up the picture frame. "Lucien, who is this?" He strode into the room and snatched the frame from her hand, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was like an electric shock. "You were told the East Wing was forbidden," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "This isn't the East Wing," she countered, her fear giving way to a strange boldness. "This is a part of you, the part you've locked away and left to gather dust. What happened here, Lucien? What happened to him?" "Get out," he ordered, his jaw tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the frame. "No," she said softly. "Not until you talk to me. I'm not one of your corporate rivals you can intimidate into silence. I live here. I'm a part of this house now, whether either of us likes it or not. I deserve to know what ghosts I'm living with. Why new?" He stared at her, his chest heaving, a silent battle raging within him. The anger in his eyes warred with a desperate, heartbreaking sorrow. For a moment, she thought he would throw her out, that he would punish her for her transgression. But instead, his shoulders slumped, and the fury seemed to drain out of him, leaving behind a man who looked utterly broken. He sank down onto the edge of the small, dusty bed, his head in his hands. The picture frame lay on the floor at his feet. "His name was Leo," he said, his voice thick with an unshed ocean of tears. "He was my son, and this was his room." The confession hung in the dusty air, heavy and suffocating. Leo, his son. Aria's breath caught in her chest. All the pieces clicked into place: the locked wing, the nightmares, the profound, soul-deep sadness that clung to him like a shroud. This wasn't just a man battling demons. This was a father mourning his child. She slowly walked over and sat beside him on the small bed, leaving a respectful distance between them. She didn't speak, didn't offer empty platitudes of comfort. She simply sat with him in the silent, sacred space of his grief. After a long time, he began to speak, his voice a raw, halting whisper. He told her about Leo's mother, his first love, who had died in childbirth. He spoke of raising his son alone, of the fierce, all-consuming love he had for the small boy who was his entire world. Leo was a bright, happy child who loved planets and stories about knights and dragons. He was the sun in Lucien's cold corporate universe. There was an accident. Lucien's voice cracked, and he stared at the little rocking horse in the corner. A kidnapping attempt. A rival I had destroyed. He wanted revenge. It went wrong. Leo... He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The gaping wound in his soul said everything. "He was 6 years old," Lucien finally whispered, the words ragged. "After that, I sealed this wing of the house. I couldn't bear to look at it. I buried myself in work, in vengeance. I destroyed the man responsible, his entire life, his family, everything. I became the monster everyone already thought I was, because it was easier than feeling this." He gestured vaguely around the room, at the ghosts of a life that was no more. Aria's heart ached for him, for the little boy she would never know, and for the man who had encased his heart in ice to survive an unimaginable pain. "You're not a monster, Lucien," she said softly, her voice full of a conviction that surprised even her. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "I bought a woman at an auction, Aria. What does that make me?" "It makes you a man desperate to feel something other than pain," she replied, looking at him, really looking at him for the first time. "You said you bought my defiance. Maybe you bought it because you wanted someone to fight for you, to fight through all these walls you've built. Maybe you didn't want someone pure. Maybe you wanted someone who could survive your darkness." He finally looked at her, his stormy eyes raw and vulnerable. In them, she no longer saw a captor, but a fellow prisoner, trapped in a cage of his own making. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his. His skin was cold, but a tremor ran through him at her touch. He didn't pull away. He laced his fingers with hers, his grip tight, desperate, like a drowning man clinging to a lifeline. They sat there for hours as the afternoon sun faded, their hands clasped together in the dusty nursery, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't tense or threatening. It was companionable, a shared space of understanding and sorrow. He had shared his deepest wound with her, and in doing so, had given her a piece of his soul. The dynamic between them had irrevocably shifted. The lines between captor and captive, master and property, had blurred into something far more complex and dangerously intimate. She had come to this house as a possession, but she was slowly becoming his confessor, his confidant. And, most terrifying of all, she was starting to see the man behind the billionaire, and she was beginning to care about him. The fight for her freedom was suddenly complicated by a fight for his soul. In the weeks that followed, the fortress began to feel more like a home. The invisible walls between them crumbled, brick by brick. Lucien started coming home earlier. They would talk for hours after dinner, not just about art or business, but about everything and nothing. He told her about his ruthless climb to the top, and she told him about her dreams of painting, of creating. He listened, truly listened, with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she never had before. He reopened the East Wing. The first time he took her by the hand and led her through the once forbidden corridors, it was a profound gesture of trust. He showed her his private study, a room filled not with corporate reports, but with sketches he'd drawn as a young man, architectural designs, intricate and beautiful. He had wanted to be an architect before his family's legacy, and subsequent tragedy had forced him down another path. He began to smile, real, genuine smiles that reached his eyes and transformed his harsh features into something devastatingly handsome. He took her to the stables on the far side of the estate, a place she hadn't known existed. He was a magnificent rider, at one with the powerful black stallion he rode. He taught her to ride, his hands gentle on her waist as he helped her onto a calm, gray mare. In those moments, galloping across the open fields with the wind in her hair, she felt a sense of freedom that was intoxicating and confusing. She was falling for him. The realization hit her one evening as they sat by a fireplace in the library, a comfortable silence between them. She watched the firelight dance across his face, softening the hard lines and illuminating the newfound warmth in his eyes. She was falling in love with her captor. The irony was a bitter pill. How could she love the man who had bought her? How could she reconcile the cold, ruthless tycoon with the tender, wounded man who shared his deepest fears with her? The conflict raged within her. Her desire for freedom, the righteous anger she had clung to for so long, was now at war with the affection and undeniable connection she felt for Lucien. She knew she couldn't stay here like this, a permanent guest in a gilded cage, her life defined by the terms of her purchase. But the thought of leaving him, of walking away from the man he was becoming, was a pain she was unprepared for. She had to know. She had to test the limits of her new reality. One morning, she packed a small bag with the few belongings that were truly hers and the emerald dress he loved. With her heart pounding, she walked down the grand staircase and headed for the front door. She didn't know if she would actually leave, but she had to know if she could. One of his security guards, the imposing man with the scar named Gideon, stepped in her path. His expression was impassive. "Miss Vega, can I help you?" "I'm leaving, Gideon," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. He didn't move. "Mr. Black did not authorize your departure." "I am not a package that requires authorization," she said, lifting her chin. "Stand aside." Gideon's jaw tightened. He discreetly spoke into his wrist communicator. The asset is attempting to leave. The word asset felt like a slap in the face. It was a stark reminder of her situation. All the progress, all the intimacy, all the shared moments dead, they mean nothing? Was she still just a line item on his balance sheet? Before she could argue further, she heard footsteps thundering down the staircase. Lucien appeared, his face pale, his eyes wide with a panic she had never seen before. He wasn't wearing his usual suit. He was in casual trousers and a shirt, his hair disheveled as if he'd run straight from his bed. "Aria," he breathed, his voice ragged. He came to a stop in front of her, his gaze fixed on the bag in her hand. The sight of it seemed to physically wound him. "I can't do this anymore, Lucien," she said, her voice trembling now. "I can't live as your purchase. I need to be free." This was the moment, the breaking point. She expected him to get angry, to drag her back to her room, to remind her of their contract. She expected the cold, ruthless billionaire to reemerge. Instead, she saw a man completely undone. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. He took a hesitant step towards her, his empire, his power, his legendary control all forgotten. All that existed in that moment was her, standing by the door, ready to walk away. His empire was built on ice and shadows, and his voice was the command that could make markets crumble. Yet, as he looked at her, standing by the door with a packed bag at her feet, Lucien Black's voice was a raw, broken thing he no longer recognized. "Don't," he whispered, the word a ghost in the cavernous room. Her only crime had been to show him the sun, and now she was taking it with her. He, who had bought her, owned her, and intended to break her, was about to shatter himself. "Aria, please." His hand, the one that signed checks for billions without a tremor, now shook as he reached for her, stopping just short of touching her arm. "Stay." It wasn't a command. It was a plea. A desperate, soul-bearing beg. "Why?" she whispered, tears finally welling in her eyes. "Give me one good reason why I should stay." "Because I'm nothing without you," he confessed, his voice cracking, the admission costing him everything. "You walked into my life, and you brought it back into color. You fought me, you challenged me, you saw through the monster to the man. You saved me, Aria. Don't leave me in the dark again." He took another step, finally closing the distance between them. He didn't touch her, but his presence was an overwhelming force of pure, desperate emotion. "I know how this started. It was wrong. It was unforgivable. But what it has become, this is real. What I feel for you is real." He finally looked her in the eye, and the raw vulnerability there stole her breath. "I love you, Aria, not as a possession. I love you. Stay. Not as my captive. Stay and build a life with me, as my equal, as my partner, as everything." Tears streamed down her face as his words washed over her, healing the last of her wounds. He loved her. He, Lucien Black, the cold-hearted tycoon, was begging her to stay, offering her not a cage, but his heart. In that moment, she understood. Her freedom wasn't about leaving the mansion. It was about the freedom to choose, and her heart, against all logic, had already chosen. She let the bag slip from her fingers, the soft thud echoing in the vast foyer. She stepped forward and laid her hand on his chest, right over his heart. It was hammering just as wildly as her own. "Okay, Lucien," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll stay." A sob of pure relief escaped his lips. He gathered her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, holding her as if he would never let her go. And in the circle of his embrace, Aria Vega knew she wasn't a captive anymore. She was home. The story had started with a transaction, a cruel sale that had stripped her of everything, but it had ended with a priceless gift of love that had redeemed a broken man and set them both free. The cruelty had been a mask, and the billionaire who had bought her was now the man who would spend the rest of his life proving he was worthy of her staying. Their future was an unpainted canvas, and for the first time, they would create it together.